The sound of chains was the first sound Amal remembered when he thought of his journey into slavery. Not the laughter of his childhood, not the voice of his mother calling him in the evenings. Not even the roar of the sea that had carried him across a world, but the rattle of iron, cold against his skin. Heavy on his ankles, he had been no more than 12 when men with guns and nets swept through his village. He remembered the smoke of huts burning, the cries of children running, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. He had tried to run, but a rope pulled him down, and then he felt the first taste of helplessness. His wrists were bound, his body dragged across mud and dust. And when he lifted his head to look back, the image that burned itself into his mind was his mother screaming his name as 2 soldiers beat her down into silence. Days later, the ship had swallowed him whole. The hold was a coffin of wood and rot, the air thick with sickness. Bodies pressed against him, men and women gasping, praying, sobbing. Some gave up and never rose again. The sea rocked them without mercy. The smell of vomit and death thick in the air. Amal learned quickly not to cry, because there was no one left to listen. Months blurred into nightmares until the ship finally spat him out onto American soil. Virginia, a land of strange language, strange faces, and strange cruelty. His skin, dark and trembling, marked him instantly as property. He was dragged to an auction block, stripped, examined like cattle. A white man with a stiff hat and hard eyes pressed Amal's arms, his back, his jaw, as if testing a horse. "Strong enough," the man said, tossing a few bills onto the table. That man was Mr. Harrington, the plantation master, who would own Amal's body from that day forward. On Harrington's plantation, Amal's name was erased. He was given the name Sam, though he never answered to it in his heart. His first day began before dawn, the overseer shouting him into the cotton fields. The work was endless, the sack heavier than his body could carry, his back bent until he thought it might break. When he faltered, the overseer's whip cracked across his shoulders. Fire tearing his flesh at night, Amal collapsed onto a straw mat in the slave quarters. Around him were faces just as hollow, eyes just as broken. He closed his own eyes and tried to hear his mother's voice. But instead, he heard the whip again. The chains again. Always the chains. Amal did not yet know how long this nightmare would last. He only knew that he was trapped in a world where his body was no longer his own, where his name had been stolen, where survival itself was the only act of defiance left to him, and still deep within him, faint as a whisper, was the memory of freedom, and the ache for it that no master could take. Asterisk, the Harrington plantation was not just a place of labor. It was a world of rules written in pain and enforced with blood. Amal learned that quickly. The land stretched wide, fields of cotton shimmering white under the sun. But to Amal the sight was not beauty. It was a prison that swallowed men and spat them out broken. The master's house stood high on the hill, white pillars gleaming like a false beacon, a place the slaves entered only when summoned to serve. It was there that Mr. Harrington, a man of wealth and cruelty, made his law. He did not carry the whip himself, that was left to the overseers, but his will hung over the fields. Like a storm cloud, Amal remembered his first encounter with him. He had been ordered to bring water to the house, his body sore from the fields, his hands trembling from exhaustion. Harrington sat at the dining table, surrounded by laughter and smoke, cards laid out before him. The men around him were planters too, all with the same smirk that came from knowing the lives of others bent to their pleasure. "Boy," Harrington said, not even glancing up. Poor Amal stepped forward, clutching the jug, trying to keep his shaking hands steady. But the weight was too much. The jug tipped, and a stream of water spilled onto the polished wooden table. For a moment, silence fell. Then laughter, sharp, cruel laughter from the white men. Harrington's eyes finally lifted. "On your knees," he said softly. Too softly. Amal hesitated. One of the overseers standing by struck him hard across the head, and Amal fell to the floor. The master leaned forward, his voice a slow drawl. "You spill water in my house, you spill blood in my house." The whip cracked across Amal's back before he could breathe. 1, 2, 3 lashes, tearing through his shirt, through his skin. The men laughed louder with every strike. Harrington raised a hand, and the overseers stopped. Amal's face pressed to the polished floor. The spilled water mixing with his own blood? Clean it, Harrington said, and so Amal, half-conscious, dragged a rag across the floor, wiping away his own humiliation while the men played cards as if nothing had happened. That night, Amal lay in the quarters, unable to move, his wounds burning, his shame heavier than his body. Around him, the others did not speak. They had all been there before. He learned the rules after that. Rules unspoken, yet carved into every lash of the whip. Never look a white man in the eyes. Never speak unless spoken to. Never falter in your work, no matter the pain. And above, I'll never forget that you are not human in their eyes. The overseers, Carter and Briggs, were the arms of this law. They carried whips, chains, and rifles, but their true weapon was fear. Carter, in particular, relished cruelty. He made a game of punishment, inventing reasons to beat the slaves. A crooked row of cotton, a misstep in the stable, a sack half full instead of brimming. Briggs was quieter, but no less vicious, his silence colder than Carter's jeers. The quarters themselves were cages. One-room cabins, dirt floors, straw mats that smelled of mold. Amal lay each night listening to the rats scurry, the moans of the wounded, the muffled sobs of women. Sometimes he heard Leela, the cook, being summoned to the master's house late at night. No one asked why. Everyone already knew. And yet, within this darkness, the slaves still carved small sparks of humanity. Amal noticed how Josiah, the elder, whispered words of scripture under his breath, his voice low enough not to be heard by overseers. He noticed how Isaac, the boy, still managed to laugh when chasing fireflies at dusk. And he noticed how, when the overseers were not watching, hands reached out passing a crust of bread, steadying a falling body, holding a shoulder in silence. But Harrington's law was always there. It was in the whip marks on Amal's back. It was in the hunger in his belly. It was in the way his name was stripped from him, replaced with Sam, a name that fit easier in a master's mouth. Amal clung to his true name in his mind. Every time Harrington or Carter barked Sam at him, he answered, but inside he whispered, "My name is Amal. My mother gave me that name. You cannot take it from me." It was a small rebellion, invisible to the world, but it kept his spirit from shattering completely. The sun rose like fire over the Virginia fields, and with it came the overseer's horn. The sound was sharp, merciless, dragging every soul from the quarters into another day of chains. Amal staggered to his feet, his back stiffed with half-healed wounds, the taste of blood still faint on his tongue from the night before. Outside, men and women filed silently toward the fields. The air smelled of damp soil and sweat. Amal walked beside Josiah, the old blacksmith whose hands were as thick as iron and whose beard was streaked with gray. Despite his age, Josiah's back bent under the weight of the cotton sack slung over him. "Keep your eyes down, boy," Josiah whispered without turning his head. "Carter's looking." Carter was already there, whip coiled at his side, his eyes sweeping the line like a hawk, looking for prey. Behind him, Briggs leaned against a post, his rifle across his chest, chewing tobacco in silence. The pair made a strange balance. Carter, all fire and cruelty. Briggs cold and watchful, but together they kept the slaves moving like cattle. Amal worked beside Isaac, the boy barely in his teens. Isaac's hands were blistered, his body small.
Ow.
But he carried a sack almost as large as Amal's. Every time he faltered, Carter's voice thundered, "Faster! Don't you crawl like worms? Harrington wants them sacks full, before sundown, and I'll have your hides if they ain't." The sun burned overhead, and the day stretched on without mercy. Sweat ran down Amal's face, stinging his lashes. His fingers, raw from pulling cotton bolls, bled into the white fluff until it was stained pink. Around him, bodies bent and straightened in endless rhythm, the air thick with groans and the sharp crack of Carter's whip. At noon, a break came not out of kindness, but necessity. The slaves were allowed to sit under the thin shade of the trees and drink from the bucket of water passed around. Emil collapsed beside Josiah, his chest heaving. Isaac sat near them, clutching his hands. Tears threatening, but held back with a stubborn bite of his lip. Josiah glanced at Amal, then at Isaac. His voice was low, almost a growl. "Keep your spirit quiet, but don't let it die. That's how you survive." Amal nodded faintly, but the words felt hollow. His spirit felt beaten thin, barely holding. He thought of his mother, her face, her voice, things that were slipping from memory day by day. He feared a day would come when he would no longer remember her name, and that thought terrified him more than the whip. The break ended with Carter's bark. As the slaves rose, Isaac stumbled, his small sack spilling onto the ground. Cotton scattered like snow. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Carter's grin spread wide. "Well, well, look what we got here." Isaac scrambled to gather the cotton, his hands shaking. Carter strode over, whip uncoiling. "You think you can waste my time, boy? You think the master's cotton belongs in the dirt?" He raised the whip high. Amal's chest tightened. He had seen men broken under that lash, their screams echoing across the fields. And now it was about to fall on Isaac. Before Amal could stop himself, he moved. He dropped to his knees beside Isaac, scooping the cotton into the sack with frantic hands. His body shielded Isaac's, his voice low. "Hurry, don't stop." Carter's eyes narrowed. He cracked the whip, the lash slashing across Amal's back. The pain was instant, a hot knife cutting through flesh. Amal bit down hard, refusing to cry out. Again, the whip fell. This time it tore his shirt open, blood seeping. Isaac sobbed, but kept gathering cotton, stuffing it into the sack. Amal forced his hands to keep moving, even as his back burned. "Look at him squirm," Carter sneered. "Think you're a hero, boy? You ain't nothin' but a dog licking dirt." The lash struck again. Amal collapsed forward, his cheek pressed into the soil, his blood staining the cotton. He felt Isaac's small hand grab his arm, tugging him, pleading silently. Finally, Briggs' cold voice cut through. "Enough, Carter. Harrington don't like blood on the cotton. He'll have your hide if the bowls come up red." Carter spat on the ground, coiling the whip back with a disappointed snarl. "Get up, boy. I ain't done with you yet." But Amal couldn't rise. His body trembled, his breath shallow. Josiah moved quietly, lifting Amal with steady arms, his eyes fixed on the ground so Carter wouldn't see the defiance burning in them. Together, they dragged Amal back to the row. Work continued, as it always did, as if nothing had happened. That night, in the quarters, Amal lay face down, his wounds burning like fire. Isaac sat beside him, tears streaking his dirt-stained cheeks. "You didn't have to," Isaac whispered, voice breaking. Amal's voice was ragged. "Yes, I did." The others sat in silence, some with eyes closed, some humming low songs of sorrow that had no words. In the corner, Josiah worked a small piece of iron by firelight, his hammer tapping gently. Amal watched him through half-closed eyes. "You'll heal," Josiah murmured without looking up. "The body breaks, but the spirit, that's what they want to kill. Don't let Amal closed his eyes. For the first time since his capture, he felt something stirring. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest spark of belonging. They were all broken, all chained. But in that shared suffering, there was a bond. Brothers in chains, bound not just by iron, but by survival. Asterisk, asterisk, the Harrington plantation did not rest when the sun went down. The fields might grow quiet, but cruelty worked shifts of its own. At night, the overseers often found new ways to amuse themselves. Those amusements always came at the slaves' expense. It was Carter who thrived most on this. Where others saw bodies as labor, he saw them as toys. And Carter loved his games. One evening, Amal and the others had barely returned from the fields, their backs bent with exhaustion, their skin burning from the day's sun. In the quarters, the smell of cornmeal mush hung in the air thin, watery, barely enough to coat a man's stomach. Amal lifted the small wooden bowl to his lips, every muscle in his body aching. When the door to the cabin flew open, Carter stood there with Briggs at his side. A silence fell. The slaves froze, bowls clutched, children pulled close to their mothers. On your feet, Carter barked, whip coiled in his hand. Master wants some fun tonight. No one moved at first. Amal felt his body stiffen, the mush still dripping from his lips. Josiah was the first to stand, slowly, like an old tree uprooting itself. One by one, the others followed. Carter's grin spread wide. Good! Out! They were marched across the yard toward the barn, the moonlight spilling silver over the fields. Inside, torches lit the walls. Harrington sat in a chair at the far end, drink in his hand. His friends gathered around him. Cards and dice lay scattered across the table. Laughter echoed in the rafters, thick with smoke. Amal's stomach churned. He knew this scene, he had seen it before. Carter lined the slaves in a row, men on one side, women on the other. Harrington leaned back, eyes glassy with drink. Which one tonight, Carter? He drawled. Carter smirked, pacing the line like a wolf. His whip tapped against his boot. He stopped in front of Amal, tilting his head. This one's got spirit. Tried to play hero in the fields. He grabbed Amal by the chin, forcing his face up. Don't he look proud even now? The white men laughed. One threw dice across the table. Another spat tobacco onto the floor. Harrington raised a hand lazily. Then let's see how long that pride lasts. Carter shoved Amal forward into the center of the barn. The whip cracked before he could brace himself. Fire ripped across his back. The white men cheered. Again. One shouted, "Make him dance." Another hollered. Carter obeyed. The lash fell again and again, each strike tearing Amal's skin, each cheer louder than the last. Amal staggered, his knees buckling, but he forced himself not to cry out. Every ounce of him screamed, but he swallowed it. He would not give them his voice. Carter's face twisted with frustration. Cry, damn you, he snarled, whipping harder. Beg. But Amal stayed silent. His vision blurred, his chest heaved, but his jaw remained locked. In that moment, silence became his rebellion. Josiah watched from the line. His fists clenched, his lips moving in silent prayer. Isaac buried his face into another's sleeve, too young to bear the sight. Lila, the cook, turned her head, her shoulders trembling. Harrington finally waved his hand. Enough. You'll kill him, and I ain't done making use of him yet. Carter sneered but obeyed, shoving Amal to the ground. Blood dripped from his back onto the dirt floor. Harrington sipped his drink, his tone casual as though he were discussing the weather. Strip him of food for 3 days. See how proud he feels then? The overseers dragged Amal out, half-conscious, his body leaving a trail of red behind him. He was dumped at the edge of the quarters like garbage. The others rushed to him when the whites were gone, lifting him gently, laying him on the straw. For 3 days, Amal was denied food, his stomach gnawing itself with hunger. His wounds festered, the air thick with the smell of blood and sweat. Yet in that darkness, the slaves fed him in secret crumbs of bread passed when no overseer looked. Drops of water pressed to his lips. It was in those moments that Amal saw the truth. The overseers could starve his body, but they could not starve the bond that tied them all together. On the 3rd night, Josiah leaned close, his voice barely a breath. Listen, boy, they can beat you, starve you, chain you, but don't you forget you still belong to yourself in here? He pressed a hand against Amal's chest. That's one thing no master can steal. Deal. Amal lay in silence, staring at the roof of the quarters. His body was broken, but Josiah's words struck deep. The overseer's game was built on humiliation. But if he refused to surrender his spirit, then perhaps he had already won a game they didn't even know they were playing. Asterisk, the nights were the hardest. The days were filled with labor and lash, the body pushed until it broke. But nights left space for memory. And memory was its own kind of pain. Amal lay on the straw mat, his body scarred and starved. The room smelled of smoke and sweat, the air heavy with the shallow breathing of men and women too weary to dream. Outside, the crickets sang their endless song. Mingling with the creak of the overseer's boots as they patrolled, he closed his eyes, and the darkness brought back Syria the sound of his mother's voice. The rough stone walls of their home, the smell of bread baking on the fire. His sister's laughter echoed faintly, a ghostly sound so distant it made his chest ache. They were all gone now, swallowed by war and chains. And yet their faces burned behind his eyelids. He whispered their names under his breath, so softly no one could hear. Yara, Samir, Mother. His tongue shaped the words like prayer beads. Each syllable, a fragile thread tying him to the life stolen from him. Beside him, Josiah stirred. The old blacksmith's voice came low. You talk in your sleep, boy. Names, always names. Amal's eyes flickered open, shame flushing his face. Josiah lifted a hand, stopping him. Don't lose them. Don't ever lose them. Names are fire in the dark. Once they're gone, you got nothing left. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then Josiah leaned back, staring at the shadows flickering on the wall. I had a wife once. Children too. Sold off years back. I don't know if they live or die. But every night I say their names. Keeps me human. Amal swallowed hard. There was no softness in Josiah's tone, but his words struck like iron on iron. Amal felt a strange comfort in knowing he was not alone in his memories. Later that week, Amal was sent to the forge to work alongside Josiah. The master needed new iron fittings for the plows, and Josiah's hands were the only ones trusted with the fire. Amal was set to pump the bellows, sweat pouring down his face as sparks leapt from the coals. The forge was hell itself, heat blasting, smoke clawing the throat butt in it. Amal felt a different kind of rhythm. Josiah's hammer rang on the anvil, steady and strong, like a heartbeat that refused to falter. Sparks danced with every strike, and Amal watched them with a strange hunger. They were small, fleeting, but in that brief moment they burned brighter than the sun. Fire teaches, Josiah said between blows, his voice booming over the roar. You break iron, you heat it, you shape it. That's life here. They break us, beat us, try to twist us into their shape. But fire also reminds you iron don't vanish. It bends, but it don't vanish. Amal nodded, though sweat stung his eyes. For the first time since his capture, he felt a spark of something other than despair. Watching Josiah shape the glowing metal, he thought of his own spirit battered. Beaten, bent, but maybe, just maybe, not destroyed. That night, lying in the quarters, Amal's mind returned to his family. Instead of drowning in grief, he clung to the thought that they lived on in him. The overseers could starve him, whip him, break his back in the fields, but his memories were his alone. They were embers glowing in the ashes of his life. Refusing to die out, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, Amal whispered once more, Yara, Samir, Mother, and in the silence of the quarters, he swore he could hear Josiah whispering too. His own names carried into the dark. Asterisk, the summer sun bore down on the Harrington plantation like a curse. It bleached the cotton fields white, turned the dirt paths into cracked clay, and left every back bent lower than before. But even the sun was kinder than the overseers. Amal had grown thinner, his ribs sharp against his skin, his wounds a patchwork of scars. Yet still, when the horn blew at dawn, he staggered to the fields with the others. Josiah walked at his side, silent as always, Isaac trailing behind like a shadow. That day, Carter was restless. He cracked his whip for no reason, driving the workers harder, faster. Fill them sacks till they burst, or I'll burst your backs instead. His voice cut across the rows like steel. Amal bent low, fingers raw as he picked. His body screamed, but his mind drifted. He thought of Josiah's words at the forge about fire and iron, about bending but not vanishing. That image clung to him, glowing faintly beneath the whip's shadow. By midday the air was thick with dust and sweat. Amal could feel Isaac slowing beside him, his small frame trembling. Then it happened as Ek dropped to his knees, his sack spilling cotton onto the ground. His breath came in harsh gasps, his lips dry and cracked. Carter's head snapped toward them. A cruel grin spread across his face. Lazy little rat, he spat, striding forward, whip already uncoiling. Didn't I warn you? Amal's chest clenched. He had seen this scene too many times before. Isaac was too small. Too weak. Carter would kill him just to prove a point. Amal's hands trembled, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then, before Carter could raise the whip, Josiah stepped forward. His voice, deep and steady, cut through the air. It's my fault. The boy was helping me. I'll take it. Carter froze, blinking in surprise. The other slaves lifted their heads, stunned. Amal's heart stopped. Josiah, the one man who had guided them all. The one whose strength had held them together was offering himself. Carter's grin widened. Well, ain't that noble? He cracked the whip, and Josiah didn't flinch. The lash tore across his back once, twice, 10 times. The sound of flesh breaking echoed across the field. But Josiah stood tall, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched. Not a sound escaped his lips. The slaves watched in silence, their breaths shallow. To cry out, to move, would invite the whip onto themselves. Yet in their eyes, a strange fire kindled. Amal felt it burn in his chest, rage, grief, and awe tangled together. Finally, Carter lowered the whip, panting. Josiah's back was a map of blood and torn flesh, but still he stood, his head unbowed. Carter spat on the ground. Get back to work, old man, before I finish the job. Josiah nodded once, slow and calm, and bent to pick cotton as though nothing had happened. That night, in the quarters, the silence was heavy. Josiah lay on his mat, his breath shallow, his body trembling. Amal sat beside him, pressing a damp rag to his wounds. Isaac hovered nearby, guilt etched across his face. It should have been me, Isaac whispered, his voice breaking. Josiah's eyes flickered open, burning even through the haze of pain. No, you live. You grow. You carry the names. His voice was barely a rasp, but each word carried weight. Amal leaned closer, whispering fiercely. Why did you take it? You'll die like this. Josiah's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. Because a man don't choose his chains, but he can choose how to carry M. The firelight flickered across his battered face. Amal realized then that Josiah was more than flesh and blood. He was iron, shaped by fire, refusing to break. And in that moment, Amal felt something shift inside him. It was not hope not yet, but it was defiance. The overseers thought the fields had only one fire, the sun that scorched their backs. They didn't see the fire that was growing in the hearts of the slaves. Passed from Josiah to Amal, from Amal to Isaac. A fire that could not be whipped out. A fire that could not be whipped out. The days after Josiah's lashing passed like slow-moving storms, heavy and suffocating. He worked when he could, dragging his broken body through the fields, his face carved from stone. The others whispered that the old man would not last the month, but no one said it aloud. To speak such things was to invite despair into their throats. Amal stayed close to him, helping when Carter's eyes weren't sharp enough to notice. Isaac hovered too, haunted by the thought that Josiah had suffered in his place. Between them grew a quiet bond, forged in the shadow of Josiah's sacrifice. But Carter had not forgotten Amal's silence in the barn, nor Josiah's defiance in the field. He was a man who fed on humiliation, and when pride stood against him, his hunger grew. One evening, the slaves were ordered into the yard outside the quarters. The overseers stood with their whips. Ed Harrington himself emerged from the big house, his cigar glowing red in the dusk. His coat was pressed, his boots polished, his face twisted in its usual sneer of false gentility. Seems some of you need reminding who owns you, Harrington drawled, his voice slow, almost bored. I hear talk. Talk of pride. Talk of strength that don't sit right with me. His eyes swept the line of boat heads until they found Amal. He pointed with the tip of his cigar. You stepped forward. Amal's stomach turned to stone. He moved slowly, each step dragging him toward the circle of firelight. Carter uncoiled his whip with relish. You've been a thorn since you set foot here, Harrington continued. Silent when you should scream. Stubborn when you should bend. That ends tonight. He turned to Carter. Break him, the whip cracked, slicing Amal's back open before he could breathe. He staggered but didn't fall. The second lash struck his chest, ripping through his shirt. He gasped, blood already trickling down his ribs. On your knees, Carter barked, swinging again. Amal clenched his jaw, forcing his legs to stay locked, though every nerve screamed for release. The lash fell again, harder. This time, he dropped to one knee. The white men watching from the porch laughed, their voices echoing like hammers against his skull. Carter sneered, circling him. Think you're strong? Think you're a man? You're nothing but a beast in chains. The whip struck his face. White-hot fire seared across his cheek, blinding his eye. Amal crumpled, face in the dirt, tasting blood and soil. The sound of cheering blurred in his ears. Beg, Carter demanded. Beg and I'll stop. Amal's lips trembled. He thought of his mother's voice, his sister's laughter, Josiah's words. He thought of Isaac's young hands, blistered but unbroken. A storm raged inside him, fear, rage, sorrow, defiance, and still he would not beg. Instead, he whispered, hoarse but steady, My name is Amal. For a moment, the yard went silent. Carter's face twisted in fury. He raised the whip again, but before he could strike, Josiah staggered forward from the line. Enough. The old man roared, his voice shaking but thunderous. The overseers froze in disbelief. The slaves gasped. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Josiah's body trembled. Blood still crusted on his torn back, but his voice was fire. You can kill us. You can chain us. But you will never own what's in here. He thumped a fist weakly against his chest. Harrington's face turned red. Break him too, he hissed. Carter lunged, but in that instant something shifted. Isaac cried out a raw, broken sound that ripped from his throat like lightning. The other slaves stirred, their bodies trembling with a rage too long caged. A shovel fell from one man's hands. A stone slipped from another's. Amal, bleeding in the dirt, felt the weight of that moment pressing down. The breaking point was here not just his, but all of theirs. Whether they rose or fell, whether they lived or died, nothing would ever be the same after this night. The night sky above the plantation was heavy with smoke and stars. The air thick with something that felt like destiny. The slaves stood frozen in the yard, their breath sharp, their eyes darting between Josiah's trembling figure, Amal bleeding in the dirt, and the overseers clutching their whips. Harrington's voice sliced through the silence. Do it. Break them all. Carter surged forward, whip raised, but Josiah didn't flinch. He stood, frail and broken, yet taller than he had ever been. Amal, through blood and haze, pulled himself up onto one knee, his chest heaving. Something unspoken sparked among the others, a recognition that their suffering was shared. Their chains heavy but not eternal. Isaac, barely 15, stepped forward without thinking, his small hands clenched into fists, his eyes burning with fury. No more. He shouted, voice cracking like glass. The overseer snarled, stepping toward him, but in that instant, the line between obedience and rebellion shattered. A rock flew, then a shovel. Then a cry rose from the throats of those who had been silent too long. The slaves surged forward, some striking with bare hands, others with tools stolen from the earth itself. Carter whipped blindly, but hands grabbed at the leather. Pulling him down into the dust, Amal, staggering to his feet, seized a broken length of wood from the ground and swung with the force of every lash he had endured. Carter's scream filled the night, cut short as he fell. Chaos exploded. The overseers fought viciously, but they were outnumbered, swallowed by the tide of rage and desperation. Harrington roared from the porch, pistol raised, firing into the crowd. One shot dropped a man instantly. Another grazed Isaac's arm, sending him spinning in pain. But the slaves didn't stop. They see OULD, in single quotes T-dot. Amal reached the steps of the big house, vision blurred. Harrington's pistol aimed at his chest. Time slowed. The world narrowed to that barrel, that finger curling around the trigger. The shot rang out. Amal staggered, falling hard to the dirt. Josiah's scream tore the night in two. The old man lunged forward, his body frail, but his spirit unbroken. He collided with Harrington, driving him back, the pistol falling from his grasp. The two men tumbled into the firelight, Harrington cursing. Josiah's hands locked around his throat. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible. Possible that the master would choke on his own cruelty, that the slaves might see dawn without chains. But Harrington was younger, stronger. With a savage shove, he drove Josiah's head against the portrayal. The crack echoed like a hammer. Josiah fell limp, the fire in his eyes extinguished. The yard went still. The overseers, bloodied, but armed with new rifles fetched from the barn, closed in. One by one, the slaves dropped their makeshift weapons, faces streaked with tears and dirt. The rebellion had lasted minutes, but it had cost lifetimes. Harrington stood, his face twisted with rage, his coat torn, his pride bleeding. He looked down at Josiah's body, then at Amal, lying gasping in the dirt. Blood pooling beneath him. "Burn the quarters," Harrington hissed. "Let them remember what happens when animals forget their place." The night filled with flames. The wooden shacks where generations had slept and wept crackled and collapsed. Sparks rising into the dark sky like the souls of the dead. Children wailed. Mothers clutched them tighter. Men stared into the fire, their silence louder than screams. Amal felt the heat wash over him. His body broken, his breath shallow. Isaac crawled to his side, his small hands pressing desperately against the wound in Amal's chest. "Stay with me," Isaac begged, tears streaking his face. "Please, brother, don't leave me." Amal's hand, weak and trembling, found Isaac's. His lips moved, the words barely a whisper, yet strong enough to carry through the smoke. "Remember my name?" His eyes closed. The world around him blurred into fire and shadow. His breath faded. By dawn, the plantation lay in ashes. The quarters were gone, the bodies buried, the chains tighter than ever. Harrington sat on his porch with a fresh cigar. His kingdom scarred but unbroken. But in the hearts of those who remained Isaac, the women. The children, Amal's defiance burned brighter than the flames that had devoured their homes. His name lived on, whispered in the dark, carried on tired lips like a prayer. And in that silence, in that grief, in that unquenchable ember, lay the truth the masters could never kill. They were not beasts. They were not shadows. They were men and women with names, with hearts, with fire, and someday the chains would break. And someday the chains would break.